A Gwynúis agus a cordial. Is mis an talamh Pádraig go Gaire, Uachtarán Acadamh Ríoga na Héireann, agus tá anhás orm fáilte choróibh go léir go dtí an acadamh inniu. Good evening. My name is Professor Pat Gyrey. I'm President of the Royal Irish Academy, and also present here this evening is the Academy's Executive Director, Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan, and the Academy's Secretary, Professor Dan Carey. We're delighted to welcome you all this evening to the Royal Irish Academy for tonight's discourse entitled The Future of the EU, Bigger and Better? And I think the question mark might be important, so we'll see that later on. Academy discourses are the oldest and most renowned series of talks in Ireland. The first discourses were presented in 1786. Historically, they were the occasion reserved for the most distinguished academics to first reveal and discuss their work in public. We now record these discourses, and they are available on the Academy's website. Before we begin, we have some short Academy business to undertake. The minutes of our last discourse explaining unionism on the 18th of April 2024 were posted online. Since our members did not inform us of any issues with these minutes, I will take these as approved, and I will sign the minute book after this discourse concludes. We welcome our esteemed speakers for this evening's discourse. Commissioner Mairead McGuinness is the European Commissioner for Financial Services, Financial Stability and Capital Markets Union. Before joining the Commission in October 2020, she was the first Vice President of the European Parliament. She served as an MEP from Ireland for 16 years and was a Vice President of the Parliament since 2014. Welcome, Mairead. Olivia O'Leary, member of the Royal Irish Academy, is a journalist, broadcaster, public commentator and writer of international standing. Her work makes an exceptional contribution to Irish society and has been praised for its perceptiveness, literary skill and humour. O'Brien Press have published 2 volumes of her radio columns for RTE Drive Time, Politicians and Other Animals, Party Animals. She was elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy in 2019. Now to the discourse, and Olivia, over to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and whoops, mics, are they working? They are working. You can never take this for granted, that they will be working. Anyway, it's lovely to be here in this esteemed institution. And, you know, I was just thinking when we were both walking in that little procession earlier, that there isn't an awful lot of ritual left in life. So it's actually very nice every so often to be part of a procession. I haven't done it, I think, since I had my first Holy Communion, but it felt very nice indeed. We are at a crucial point in the life of the European Union, so it's very fit that we should be talking to Commissioner McGuinness today. We've been dealing in the last few years with a worldwide pandemic, with the massive change to the Union that Brexit offered, with war on our borders in a candidate EU country, and with growing resistance to the European Green Deal and to the level of immigration into the EU. And we don't know really what these challenges to the system will do throughout Europe in the forthcoming elections. But we know, I suppose, that things will change after the June elections. But to explore what some of the thinking is at the top table of the European Commission, we are joined, as you've heard earlier, by Ireland's member, Mairead McGuinness, Commissioner for Financial Services, Financial Stability and Capital Markets. And as I well know, of course, Mairead in her time has been an agricultural journalist and broadcaster, as well as a Vice President of the European Parliament. Just to go with our title, Bigger and Better, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the various points at which the EU enlarged itself. Will it get larger? How much larger will it get? I look down that long list of candidate countries and I wonder, when is the next big step going to happen?
Well, I think it's worth looking at the fact that Ireland's joining Europe was the first enlargement. So Ireland, the UK and Denmark. And then we marked recently the last big enlargement, in 2004, so 20 years ago, we had a huge number of countries joining. There's never been a figure put on how large will Europe become. I think enlargement becomes necessary when countries seek to join and when there's an imperative for us to look at them as candidate countries. And I suppose there was enlargement fatigue because we did, as I say, mark 20 years and then Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia. I think there was a resistance to even thinking about enlargement, a little bit like treaty change. There's a resistance in terms of thinking about treaty change. But the war in Ukraine, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, I think has changed everything. To some extent, when Russia invaded Crimea, we reacted, but maybe not in a significant way. So when they went in and further invaded, it was, I suppose, a wake-up call to Europe that there is war now on European soil. That Ukraine had, if you like, was looking towards the European Union. It had a hope that that would be its destination. And also there are other countries that also seek to join. So I think what we do say, if you're looking at a number, is it could enlarge to be more than 30, but not to put a figure on it. And it won't happen overnight. It will happen over time because it's merit-based. So I think there was some anxiety that this was a rush to allow countries in, even if they weren't, if you like, meeting all the criteria. That isn't the case. So you're talking about some longer periods than next year, for example. That said, Ukraine really has managed to address some of the issues that it needs to address already because it's very keen, even in a wartime situation. And some of those things are areas that I look after, like, financial crime, anti-money laundering, corruption, then there's judicial issues. And there's a lot of issues there to be addressed, not only in Ukraine, but in other countries as well. So no limit to the numbers, merit-based. And yes, I think there is an appetite now to deal with enlargement. Where we haven't really had a discussion yet is what does that mean for the institutions, for the European Commission, for decision making, but that will all be dealt with in time. So I think even in these elections there isn't much discussion around enlargement. Yeah. I hear some maybe in the farm sector being a bit worried that Ukraine is a huge producer of commodities, global supplier, and how will that impact common agriculture policy? And I think sometimes we look to enlargement as almost endangering what we have, rather than seeing enlargement as adding value to everybody, because those countries that came in 20 years ago have hugely benefited from being part of a single market, but being able to move. We've benefited from citizens coming to our country.
We have.
Hugely.
All those skilled workers that came in here, we needed very badly.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was talking to a man yesterday, and he had a very Irish accent, but what I knew, he said, I'm Polish. Well, I said, I couldn't really make it out. And he said, I came here 20 years ago, when I was 16. And it was really interesting to hear his story. His father came first, and then the family came, and he has aspirations maybe to live in the Irish countryside, maybe to go back to Poland, but fully enjoying that experience. Now, I suppose the downside for some countries, particularly those, the newer member states, even though if they're not so new, they did suffer a brain drain. Yeah, they did suffer that. But people are going back now. But I think the imperative for enlargement is because for our own security, and also to make sure that we have an openness to new members, rather than saying at some point, well, actually, the European Union is now closed and we're not accepting anyone in.
There's no more room. Yeah. But can we just go back a little bit to Ukraine? And it's something that I suppose a lot of people have been uneasy about nearly for the last 10 years. The extent to which there was perhaps an element of triumphalism in the way the West moved in there, the British, the Americans did too, saying, this is fantastic, the Orange Revolution is great, we're going to have a new border for Europe and the European Union right up against Russia. And I was thinking about, God save us and all harm, the Monroe Doctrine, the notion of areas where big powers have certain control and other big powers don't get involved. And I remember wondering, is this wise? Are we creating expectations in Ukraine that we can't meet, and in the process, poking the bear?
Well, I mean, you can interpret it that way, or you can say the opposite, that if people in Ukraine freely choose to look to Europe, they should be free to do that. And we shouldn't turn our gaze because we're kind of very cautious. I think that would be a wrong approach. But the truth is that when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and now the war is there and continuing even as we speak, there was an imperative for us to acknowledge that we couldn't just turn our gaze because it had implications not just for Ukraine but also for Europe. So there's no doubt there's huge fragmentation now. There is a worry about not just what's happening Ukraine, Europe, Russia, China, Taiwan, the US. So at the moment, the whole geopolitical landscape is very unsettled. And that is alarming when you think about the potential for further conflict and how it's managed. And I haven't even mentioned what's happening these days in Gaza and the wider Middle East. So I think there are, interpretations. You have to deal with the real world. I mentioned that maybe when Crimea was invaded, we didn't respond. We had some sanctions, but not very deep. I think we didn't perhaps realize that it would grow, that it would become a much bigger threat and challenge, and it has become that. And therefore, you either turn away from it as neighbours or you show solidarity, which is what the European Union has done.
Well, let's pick up one or two of the things that you mentioned there, and something that I think you're particularly responsible for, which would be sanctions. Are they having the effect we want?
I'm responsible for implementing sanctions, so the political decisions are taken by ministers, and I think it's 13, if not, we're working on a 14th package. They are working. Remember that some of the figures we're hearing from Russia's economy, nobody can verify them. It is a war economy, so all the focus is on producing for war. Russia has been decoupled from the global financial system. We have frozen a lot of Russian central bank money. We have sanctioned a lot of individuals. What's obviously happening, and I think this is something that Europe now realizes we have to deal much more effectively with, is that we have friends, but Russia also has many friends.
And China being one of them.
And circumvention is happening very definitely. Our colleague David O'Sullivan is working at the international level, so visiting countries where we know goods are going through and false documentation, and the products are ending up on the battlefields in Ukraine. But as I said to the member states recently at a workshop, circumvention starts at home. So the goods are from Europe when they're going through and getting back into Russia. So we're in the war in Ukraine. But where we're really active is trying to cut off that supply chain. The more we have put pressure both on the financial side and on access to these dual-use goods that can be used in the battlefield, the more Russia has sought to find people, including with oil transportation. They're using very old fleets.
And India is buying from them.
And this goes back maybe to your point, Olivia, about the way the world is and the fragmentation of the power blocks. So certainly we have learned that not everybody supports what Europe is doing, but we support democracy and freedom and those basic things that maybe in Ireland we take for granted as opposed to value.
But the war goes on, and there are EU countries that are using liquefied gas from Russia.
Yeah, I mean, the war goes on, because Russia has turned itself into a war economy. Russia, as I understood it in the beginning, expected this war to be over within months. I think the fear we all have is that it will go and last much longer. A prolonged war with all of the human cost that goes with it and the financial cost that goes with it and the rebuilding cost which will have to be paid for, I imagine, also by Europe.
But Mairead, is there not something that the EU should be doing about the fact that Belgium and France and Spain are still purchasing liquefied natural gas?
But they're not breaking sanctions. So you have to be very clear that when Russia turned off the gas supplies to Germany, we did already move away from using anything that came in the direction through pipeline. So we diversified supplies at a cost. We had to get fuel from Norway and from the US. We were more efficient with energy use, and we started investing more in renewables. In one sense, we did an incredibly good job to keep the lights on. So the challenge for Europe at that moment was, if everything goes, if we have no fuel, what happens internally in Europe? So it was a really, really difficult time to get that balance right between keeping our economy going, coming out of COVID, showing solidarity with Ukraine by stopping the purchase. I mean, I'll be very clear that when I talk to colleagues from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia on the borders of Russia, they would go much further and faster because they know the story and the history. And they are always the colleagues who push more strongly for tougher action.
So why aren't we going further and faster?
Because, we're going as fast and further as we can with the political agreement of countries. So I cannot force, or the Commission cannot force, countries to accept a package that goes beyond what they think is appropriate. So we've taken very clear steps. So we've started at a certain package and then we've moved to 13 and 14. So more will come. I think the big question is, why didn't the war stop? I remember somebody asking me that after the first month. I wish it was that straightforward. But what we have certainly created is a very difficult place for Russia. They are insisting that they will continue this war, but we are making it very difficult for them to do that by both our sanctions on the financial system and our sanctions on dual-use goods and on services and on oligarchs. But don't underestimate the power of those who are not our friends to allow for circumvention. And don't underestimate that in wars, people like to profit from them. And I think that's the horrible side of all of this, that there are operators who try to profit.
The other thing that this whole Ukrainian situation on our borders has highlighted is the need for greater coordination, particularly on defence and security among European member states. Is it time that countries like Ireland have to take on board the need to take much more seriously the need to defend the union of which it is a member?
I would put security and defence in that order. I think Ireland is neutral. That is not going to change. And I think, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Micheál Martin, has been very strong around this whole topic. He had very good dialogues last year around security and defence. Look, I look after the financial system. My biggest concern is if there is a serious attack, a cyber attack, that knocks out our financial system and that, our money is wiped from our accounts and you cannot recover, that will be enormously and horrifically impactful. So we need to think about security and defence. We need to think about defence not just in traditional ways as we do, but in defence of our infrastructure, the cables that connect us, the technology, the systems that we all rely on now for ordinary and everyday things. But to go back to your point generally around security and defence, there has always been a discussion around this. So my first elections to the European Parliament is 20 years ago in 2004. I would have been attacked about being part of a group that want an EU army. So the word EU army was always every single election, and it's not going to happen, and it hasn't happened. But, there are facts and figures that show that as a collective, when you look at the spending of Europe on defence, we spend badly, we spend a lot of money. We don't spend in a coordinated way. So if we needed to cooperate, if those who have armies need to cooperate, they can't do it because the equipment isn't interoperable. So I think it's about a strategic look at what are we investing in security and defence? Is it being wasted, or is it actually adding to a sense of security and defence? And I think there is a heightened awareness of that now. You'll hear other leaders like France, Germany even, who were very adverse to even speaking about this topic, now aware that we need to take it seriously ourselves. It's very interesting that Mario Draghi, the former president of the ECB, has warned us on three things. One of them is that, relying on the US to defend us is no longer as certain as it was.
I was about to ask you about that. What if Trump wins the next election?
Well, you see,
and pulls out of NATO or reduces his contribution to NATO?
Yeah, well, I suppose when I think of elections and results that we don't like, we all support democracy. And sometimes democracy gives us a result that we may not like, but we have to respect it. And that might also go for the composition of the European Parliament, because there's expectations it might go in different directions. So we don't know the what if. I will say, if I pull back and look at when there was a Trump presidency and talk to my colleagues in the financial services area, they would say that at the service level, so at institutional level, as opposed to the political level, they were able to cooperate as normal with the US and deal with financial stability issues and institutional issues that need to be talked about. So that's why in one way strong institutions are really important, that regardless of political leadership, there's a sense of duty amongst those that serve in public institutions. But you're right to raise it insofar as it may make us even more alert to the fact that Europe has to stand on its own 2 feet. I've been saying in speeches that I feel that even in my time, I think Europe is now less naive about its place in the world and indeed about the world. We do talk about our values and democracy and the rule of law, and I think that's all to the good. But we also realise that many parts of the world don't quite think as we do and don't respect what we have. And their leaders don't want their citizens to have what we have. So that's why the discussion around security and defence is not about Europe going to war. It's about Europe securing its peace. Yeah. But also Europe securing its peace when wars can be waged at a very different level. That you may never see a person with a gun or a weapon, but that you can have an attack on systems that would be very, very damaging. And when I speak to those who are in the financial services area, this is a constant. This happens every single day, all the time. Yeah, and they have to keep ahead of it, and you have to invest in it, and you need the brightest brains. But remember, Russia is now on a path of trying to attack our systems, also in the run-up to elections. Yeah, so indeed. I think the discussion is more mature now. It's not about yes or no to an EU army. That's not the case. Although it is interesting in some member states where conscription was a thing of the past, are now looking again towards getting young people to come in and do service in the army. And I think it's quite an interesting development. Countries have joined NATO that in the past were not looking to join NATO. But from an Irish point of view, I think people respect our neutrality. I think there should be great clarity around that.
Well, one was listening to President Macron recently making a speech, and he was very much banging the drum about the need for Europe to be more united and more serious about the fact that it was perhaps becoming more isolated, as you say, that the friends we used to rely on ain't there anymore. And he wasn't just talking about defence, he was talking about economies. And I just wanted to ask you, if we're going to have a more united Europe, one that operates very much more like the United States does, for instance, we're going to have to be ready for a much bigger budget take, aren't we, from us? I mean, if we're serious about it, if we're serious about setting up the sort of secure information systems that you're talking about, not to mention a more secure capital market system, aren't we going to have to start thinking about handing over more dosh?
I'm going to talk about the dosh in a minute, but I think the point around the French view, we talk about open strategic autonomy. Sometimes colleagues say strategic autonomy, but essentially it's about that realization that there are certain parts of our supply chains for goods that we should really look at being more secure internally. It's not about protectionism, and it shouldn't be. And it's not about Europe looking inward, because Europe has always been better at looking outward and working with global partners. The point on the budget is more nuanced to say that we need more because we need to spend more. I think it's a decision for member states. Do they spend themselves on these things, or do they contribute to a European budget? Do they contribute more?
And I'm just interested, you sat at that top table. Yeah. Coming after a few years at that top table, has Europe become more federal and united in its view, or is the nation-state idea still strong as ever?
Well, we're united in diversity, and the nation-state is strong. Particularly, you mentioned capital markets, because I'm working to try and complete this big project, Capital Markets Union. In other words, we have 27 fragmented capital markets. We could really do a lot better if we pulled ourselves together. It's complicated because there are national issues, so there are always and will always be national issues. It's how you deal with them. And on the budget, I'll tell an interesting story. So when I joined first, Ireland was still a net beneficiary of EU funding. And then we became net contributors, and I would have visitors groups over to the Parliament, and I'd explain that we were now net contributors, and there would be a shuffling in the seat as if to say, gosh, didn't think that would happen, as if Ireland would always get. And, you know, I would kind of challenge and say, but actually we got when we needed support. So in the Commission office in Dublin, where I work from sometimes, we've all these old newspaper cuttings about, you know, when Ireland joined and the whole big excitement of it. But we're one of the established. We're there a long time. Sometimes I think our conversations are still about, yeah, we're in, but we're small and we have to be minded differently. I think we're in to lead. On all of these topics, including on the budget. So we do need to have a conversation about, so I hear people saying we need more for agriculture, we need more for the environment, we need more for security and defence. Is there a willingness amongst member states that contribute to do that? I would say at the moment there isn't, but I think the debate will have to be had. We realised that we did something after COVID which nobody would have anticipated, joint borrowing, so the recovery funds. Many thought that could never happen. It did happen. So sometimes things can happen, and I think for Ireland, in this conversation, it is about what do we want Europe to do. Do you think if we contribute more into the budget centrally that we will do things better? Or do member states still want to keep control of and do their own thing? But that conversation will start and is already beginning. The Irish presidency will be soon, so I think it could be even during our presidency again that we'll have these conversations. I mean, I remember being on the budget committee of the Parliament, and I mean, the European budget is not an easy instrument to get your head around. But essentially, the Commission can only provide support for policies through the budget. Most of it contributed from member states and some from the VAC. But there is already a discussion. The European Parliament tends to push for more budget than the member states are willing to give. So there's always that tension.
Two things then, let's talk about them because they're highly political. One is immigration and the other one is the environment and the Green Deal. So talking first about immigration, and I'm conscious of an election coming up in which this is going to be increasingly an enormously important issue. There has been recently this new pact on migration and asylum, which has already been heavily criticised by Amnesty International, who feels that it sets back the rights of refugees and asylum seekers. And we've had books like really interesting one by Sally Hayden, the Irish writer here, about the people who try to get across in those terrible boats. And then when she's describing camps in Tunisia and places on the outskirts of Europe, where it would seem the European Union has done some fairly shabby little deals to keep migrants who are trying to make their way into the Union away from it, and they end up living effectively in sort of concentration camps, refugee camps, whatever. Are you happy about the way we've handled migration, and particularly about this new idea of, keep them out, put them in camps in Turkey or Tunisia?
I think Europe faces a hugely difficult challenge because, well, you've mentioned Amnesty, and I've read that book, and it's worth reading again about the horrors. Yeah. There are human traffickers who feed off those horrors. But you haven't mentioned that the debate in Ireland is quite difficult at the moment around migration. It's not just coming from far right or whatever. This is a discussion that we have to acknowledge is happening. I think what the European Union and the Commission has tried to do is make sure that there is agreement. So the pact you referenced is agreed by the member states and the European Parliament. So it's a democratically agreed packet of legislation to address weaknesses. So strong external borders are necessary. People who are entitled to protection under international law have got to be treated fairly and quickly. And those who are not entitled to be in Europe, we have to be clear, they have to be returned. This pact provides for all of those things and more investment in the infrastructure that's required. On your wider point, as a human being, do I like to see what's happening in Gaza today? None of us do. It's horrific. Do I like to think that there are people who want to come because they see what we have? And they're not, they're in Tunisia, and we have done, I wouldn't use your terminology in describing them. I think what Europe has tried to do is to work with countries. And we've supported Turkey in relation to refugees, the Lebanon also. it is a very difficult reality that if you have a smartphone in countries where there is both, no democracy and you've no job and your life is awful and you see what Europe has to offer, there is a pull factor to that. But politically, if you respond to that by opening borders, then you destabilize everything. It sounds really harsh to say that when you read Sally Hayden's book. It sounds terrible. But I think we also, in this pact, are going to tackle those who are making a fortune on the backs of people who have nothing. So you see young men leaving their homes, they borrow money from their families who borrow it from somewhere else. And sometimes the horrific story, as we know, of migrants who end up in trucks and die, then this news goes back to their home. And these families are saddled with this incredible and horrible debt and death of their family members. I think this is a global problem. It is not likely to ease anytime soon. What we also do in Europe, which is not really, I think, understood, we invest a lot of money trying to help countries build up both their economy and their political infrastructure.
Ursula von der Leyen was talking about that today.
That is the answer. That Europe, again, and we shouldn't look for praise or claps on the back, but we do an awful lot of good work. My colleague, Commissioner, really looks after this area. China does it as well, but China goes in and does it very differently. It very much stamps China is in there. We do it, I think we do it very effectively, and we have to do much more of it. But we've been doing that for a long time. Africa has huge potential as a continent. Other parts of the world where there's difficulties have huge potential as well. We have to use our resources to assist.
Yeah, I must say, when she said that today, I remember thinking, yes, that makes more sense. That's to a certain extent an acceptance of the inequality, and an acceptance that if we leave the inequality the way it is, we'll go down too.
It's an acceptance of our responsibility.
It is. Yeah.
And it's very interesting. If we look at the African continent, some countries do not have a flowery view of Europe, of some European countries, because of history. Ireland is different. I've had very interesting conversations with leaders in Africa, and they are warmer towards Ireland. So we have a
because you
better
have a little
position.
halo around your head.
Well, I don't know. My
Irish.
halo has long slipped, but at least they know that we have a different history. So I think we have a responsibility even to do much more, because it not only for vested self-interest, I think that wouldn't be the only reason you do it, because a world that has less inequality is a much better world, a world where families can stay together rather than a father or mother having to leave behind children with grandparents is a much better world.
And everybody benefits.
And maybe I should say this when we're talking about migration, that when we go into our hospitals, in our care homes, in all of these places, we see people who've travelled very far to come to Ireland to look after our most vulnerable. I remember being asked a question in 2004 about, did I not feel, terrible leaving my family and going to Brussels for 2 or 3 or 4 days a week?
And you, a woman and a mother.
And I said, do we not feel a little bit terrible when we, I mentioned Filipino nurses, for example, who leave their children, not just for 3 or 4 days a week, but for years, and send money back. I said, I wish we would think of them occasionally and actually value their input to us. And the world will turn on this, because if you look at, there's labour shortages in Europe now. We actually need people. And I think all of this conversation around keeping people out and whatever is really against the reality.
It will turn, because Europe's birth rate will make it turn.
Absolutely.
But just to move on to the Green Deal, and you'd be very familiar with this. The fact of the matter is that any political party heading into elections in June will be conscious that the farming community in particular feel quite aggrieved. They feel that it's not understood, what it takes out of them, that they're not really being given the incentives to do what is wanted of them, and that they're being painted as the bad guys.
Yeah, hands up here. I'm from a farm. I'm married to a farmer, so I live on a farm when I'm here. So I was aware of this before it became violent in the sense of protest. I had conversations when I was still in the Parliament with some colleagues in the Commission, and I was trying to say, look, the farmers are very independent and they're very proud. And the last thing we should have done was sort of say, you've caused this problem and you have to fix it. So I think there wasn't very effective communication because the reality is that farmers have changed over the decades as we've asked them to do. I think the second point we didn't do very well, I was a very young reporter, maybe 22, 23, when I worked on a program called Landmark on RTE. We used film at the time. And we did lots of stories encouraging farmers to rip out hedgerows. We showed them how to drain the land, and they got grants for it, and how to use lots of fertilizer. And that was public policy. That was European public policy, and our research agencies pursued that. And we went too far with that agenda. So now we're asking farmers of a certain generation who did all we asked them to do almost the opposite. To drain, redrain, if you like, flood land again, use less, replant hedgerows. Now they're replanting hedgerows and they are leaving more ground that is wet, but it goes against the grain of a certain generation of farmers. And when you're trying to do big change, it's not even about the money. It's about the respect thing and the psychology behind it. So farmer frustration vented itself in protests. Not so much in Ireland, I think, but across Europe. They were in Brussels and whatever. And maybe sometimes you need a protest to let the steam out of it, and then people have to gather around. What's really interesting on the environment, particularly land...
But do you think we're going to have to step back a little bit from the Green Deal?
We can't, because we have now legally bound objectives around climate neutrality by 2050, and I don't think anyone wants to step back from that. I don't think anyone wants us to stop restoring nature. I mean, when you go for a walk in the countryside today and you hear birds, and I mean, I must say around where we live, it would do you good to listen to just, and very early in the morning sometimes, but even in the evening out, just listening to the bird, the wildlife that's there. So nobody wants that destroyed. Past practice has damaged the landscape and the environment, and we need to find ways of addressing that. And we need also to look at what we're producing and how we're producing, and we can do that with research. So I don't think it's a case of rowing back. It's a case of maybe listening a bit better. And remember, car drivers are very upset about carbon tax. People are worried about these things. I mean, somebody said to me recently that 2/3 of people in Europe are really keen for, climate and environmental action, and 1/3 aren't. I would make the point that even in the 2/3, when it comes to people actually having to do something, that's when you're really tested. Yeah. And I think if all of us are a bit honest about it, we all want to do our very best. But it can be very difficult to do that. Now, the challenge for Europe is not only are we worried about our delivery on the Green Deal, but competitiveness is now a big topic. So the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, Chinese subsidies, all of these things, our industry is concerned about its own future. There's just a genuine worry about our costs because energy prices went up, and then we're back to trying to invest in this more sustainable future, which is why we hear more about sustainability than green. And sometimes the language does matter. I drive this sustainable finance framework, so what we are doing is actually asking companies to report not just money, but sustainability, their record on this. Investors then can look at these metrics and decide who they're going to invest in for the future. So we have an awful lot of the elements in place to get towards our targets. It's not a surprise to me that we've had blips along the way. And maybe one last word. I think ideology versus pragmatism. We need more pragmatism on this. I think if it's all about ideology, it alienates those who don't feel so ideologically driven.
Well, then can I put a question to you that's a little about the ideology before I throw this out to the audience, which is that increasingly looking around Europe, it would seem that the results of this forthcoming election may show quite a swing to the right. Parties, some of them are farmers' parties, some of them are anti-immigrant parties. There are questions, for instance, to Ursula von der Leyen about her relationship with Giorgia Meloni, who's now in charge in Italy. Are you fearful of a swing to the right?
I'm not fearful because I made the point about democracy. I mean, if in elections people vote for a change to the right or left, that's the result you work with. You mentioned the relationship of the President of the Commission with the Prime Minister of Italy. She has to have a working relationship with all Prime Ministers, regardless of what political groups they're with, and she manages those relationships very effectively. I think the results of this election, I mean, there's always headlines about and speculation, but when I chaired debates and votes in particular in the European Parliament, it was very noticeable that when I looked down, the extreme right and the extreme left invariably voted the same way, but for different reasons. And that's always fascinated me, but it would I'd kind of go, well, yeah. So that's a reality. The second observation is that there's right, and there's far right, and there's further right, and there's fragmented right. And I think you need to be mindful that some people who are extremely anything, including extremely left, don't agree with each other because it's very much a personal view that I have. And in there's the Identity and Democracy political group in the Parliament, which I suppose is the extreme right. Very often they don't agree internally, so they don't always coalesce around a particular point. There's now the latest news, which is that the AfD, the German party, are now being pushed out of that group. So I think you need to understand that the fragmentation of the far right is quite significant, so they may not be a force to reckon with. The ECR group is the next, if I go away from the extreme to a right group, I work very well with colleagues in that group, not all, but some. And then my EPP group are centre-right, and we go then towards the left. It seems that there will be some movement from the left towards the right. But I think the centre will hold. This is the interesting thing about Europe. No matter about election campaigns, the only way you can actually make progress in the European Parliament is working with other groups to get agreement. So you can shout all you like on about something and it'll make a great video. But if you're really keen to make progress or change, so EPP will have to work with others, sometimes maybe with ECR, sometimes maybe with Liberals and Socialists, and sometimes all will agree. So I think the fear of a vicious swing in one direction is not the case. I suppose I'm old enough to realise that, things do swing. Moods do swing. And that's why the migration conversation which we had, which was brief, is really important, because what I've been hearing would trouble me as well. And it's not just extreme. People are saying things now that they're hearing and they're owning themselves without really thinking it through. But you can't dismiss where people are at on these topics. We have to try and communicate a bit better. And I think this last commission, under the leadership of von der Leyen, I mean, it's been crisis after crisis after crisis. And I think the incoming Parliament and Commission have now to take on with all of these things. We have a migration pact, we have to implement it. We have to look at our place in the world and how we can be stronger internally so that we're better externally. We have to work on the wider development on global issues and also on climate. We're a small percentage of the global emissions. That doesn't mean that we should get a free pass and do nothing. But it does mean that if we don't work with others, then all we do will not be sufficient. So when we work on sustainable finance, we actually work with China on this as well. So we have an international platform where people that we have different views on other topics, we are working together on this. We work on international standards around sustainability reporting because our companies are global, and also because we want the rest of the world to be on the same journey as we are. So Europe alone on lots of topics cannot solve these problems, especially on climate. And that's why I would be concerned, not so much as you say that we'll move away from our targets, but that the world, if we did go in that direction, would see itself as saying, well, if they're not, we're not. In fact, we have a duty to lead in this because we developed using fossil fuels. We had the benefit of all of that.
Yeah,
so I mean, we do have a responsibility.
Listen, a last question to you. In terms of whether you continue as our commissioner may well be, the lottery that is part of coalition governments. But if you don't continue as our commissioner, would you run for the presidency?
Could we have a show of hands, please? Because I couldn't possibly answer that question myself. Look, I mean, you know that I ran before. I'm a great believer in life throws you what's for you. And things that I haven't succeeded on, I've actually won. In other words, I ran for election in 2007 for the Dáil, and I didn't succeed in Louth. But it didn't upset it. I thought, well, that's the right answer. And it was the right answer because I stayed in the European Parliament, and I felt I made a much bigger contribution than I could have had I been here. I didn't get the Fine Gael nomination the last time round, so I can't say I'm not interested. But I suppose I don't know what I'm going to do next, and I quite like that idea, the little bit of mystery. I have said publicly, as you know, that I'm willing to serve again as Commissioner. I mean, I wasn't meant to get this role, as you know. So it's nearly been a great challenge that I did, and I've really relished being in the room. As you know, I'm the only native English speaker, which is weird, in the room of 27. It's actually an advantage, apparently, because apparently I'm very clear, and I suppose that's nice to hear. But of course, as you said, who will be the next commissioner is for the government to make the decision, and I will fully respect that. And whoever he or she is, I will absolutely help them and support them. It's a really important job for Ireland, whoever is in that role. And we've sent very good people to serve us, and I've been very lucky to have an opportunity to serve at this level. But I also live on a sheep farm, and it means that I'm very grounded. So if I'm stuck for work, there's always sheep to be moved. And any of you who know sheep, they have a mind of their own, as my husband has, because he's never very clear about where he's moving them from or to. It's a mystery, and you have to just go with the flow. So I'm very adaptable. But it would be an honour, I mean, to serve as President of Ireland, almost a scary honour. But as I said, I've never plotted and planned in that way, and I think if things are for you, they don't pass you.
Fair enough. Commissioner Mairead McGuinness, thank you very much.
So a sincere thank you on your behalf to Commissioner McGuinness and also Olivia O'Leary. I think you'll agree it was the most enjoyable and thought-provoking discussion, and provided evidence, not that we needed it, as to how skillful and well-informed a politician you are. And there's no doubt that Ireland has benefited over the last number of decades by having such a representative in Brussels. But actually I also think that the European Union has benefited by having such a fantastic representative on their behalf as well. So Mairead, you are grounded, and I do remember you on Landmark. And growing up in the South Tipperary farming community, Landmark was a must-see event, I have to say, and a must-listen-to radio programme was Martin Market, because the beef prices and how they changed, we listened to that really very closely. So, you know, it brings it all back. And of course, then you watch Today Tonight and all that, and you know about what a fantastic political commentator Olivia O'Leary is, but also how she really asks all the challenging questions, which she did this evening as well, but the type of questions we may well have liked to ask as well. So we've been very fortunate to have a discourse with two fantastic people, A, to ask the questions, and B, to answer the questions. I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And it's always a nice sign of how good a discourse is as to how ready people are to ask questions. So your participation at that level is really appreciated as well. This is the final academic discourse in our current programme. The discourse series will recommence in October. I know you can't wait. And we'll focus on different aspects of artificial intelligence, or AI, or for those of you who don't mix it up with AL, which is the periodic table element aluminium. So do not make that mistake. People have made that in the past. As a chemist, by the way, I don't make that mistake. Details will be added to the Academy website, and we'll have a brand new website coming your way in the next number of weeks as well, www.ria.ie, as soon as they will be available. For any members of the Academy, and I do see some of you here this evening, if you haven't already done so, please sign the attendance book in the hall outside the library. So again, thank you all for attending this evening's discourse, and do please join us now for refreshments in the front rooms. Thank you.